This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The heavy iron gates of the imperial palace did not merely keep the world out, they held a suffocating golden silence within. Emperor Cassian Virel moved through the corridors like a ghost of polished steel, his footsteps echoing against marble that had never known the warmth of a commoner's touch. To Cassian, silence was the ultimate achievement of a ruler, the physical manifestation of a kingdom so perfectly ordered that no voice dared to rise in dissent. He governed not by the sword alone, but by the chilling expectation that emotion was a chaotic luxury his subjects could not afford. In his world, a sob was a rebellion, and a plea was a crack in the foundation of his absolute authority. He had spent decades turning his heart into a fortress of ice, believing that to feel was to falter, and to listen was to lose control of the empire he had bled to build. Yet standing in the shadow of the great throne was Althea Ren, a girl whose presence was so fragile it seemed the very air of the court might crush her. She had been brought before him not for a crime of violence, but for the unforgivable sin of visible grief in the presence of the crown. As Cassian looked down from his heights, his voice was a low, rhythmic thrum of cold command, ordering her to stifle her breath and compose her face, for the emperor did not tolerate the untidiness of human suffering. He expected her to tremble and obey, to vanish back into the gray masses of the city. He commanded her silence with the same absolute certainty he used to deploy his legions, assuming that a direct order from the son of the empire could extinguish the fires of a breaking heart. But as the decree left his lips, something happened that no strategist could have predicted. Althea did not speak, she did not scream, and she did not beg for mercy. She simply looked into the hollow depths of his eyes as the first tear escaped, carving a slow, defiant path through the dust on her cheeks. It was a soundless explosion. In that moment, the vast, terrifying silence of the palace was shattered by the sheer weight of her unspoken agony. Cassian found himself frozen, watching a single drop of salt water achieve what no enemy army ever could. It bypassed his armor and struck the dying embers of his conscience. The emperor realized, with a sudden and violent tremor of his soul, that while he could command the tongues of 1,000,000 men, he was utterly powerless against the scream of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her tears. Before we continue with the story's development, take a moment to connect with this journey. If you want to follow each chapter of this emotional transformation between absolute power and vulnerability, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like to support profound narratives like this one, and comment below what you would do if you were facing the emperor's icy gaze. Your presence is what gives voice to this story. The great emperor Cassian Virel was a man sculpted from the very granite of the mountains that bordered his vast territory. His life was a symphony of structure, where every hour was accounted for, and every soul under his rule was a mere gear in a massive, silent machine. He sat upon his throne not as a man, but as a monument to discipline, his face a mask of indifference that had long forgotten how to smile or scowl. To the world, he was the sun, distant, blinding, and necessary. But to those who walked the halls of his palace, he was a winter that never ended. He believed that the only way to prevent the bloody mistakes of his ancestors was to remove the volatility of human emotion from the equation of governance entirely. In the quietest corners of the capital, Althea Ren lived a life that was the polar opposite of the gilded cage of the palace. She was the daughter of a weaver, a girl who had learned to move through the world like a shadow, unnoticed and unbothered by the grand designs of the state. Her hands were calloused from labor, and her heart was heavy with the weight of 1,000 small injustices that the empire deemed too insignificant to notice. She was part of the invisible foundation, the people who were expected to provide the taxes and the labor without ever raising their eyes to the heights of the citadel. Her existence was defined by endurance, a steady pulse of survival in a world that only valued the strength of steel. The tragedy that brought them together was as sudden as a lightning strike in a clear sky. A local magistrate, eager to impress the crown with his efficiency, had ordered the clearing of a small market district to make way for a new military parade ground. In the chaos of the forced eviction, Althea's family home, along with all their looms and livelihood, was reduced to splinters in the name of imperial progress. When she tried to protest, she was met with the cold end of a spear and told that her sacrifice was for the greater good of the emperor's vision. She was left standing in the ruins of her world, a girl stripped of everything but her breath and a grief so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. Driven by a desperation that bypassed her natural fear, Althea found herself at the gates of the palace during the Great Audience, a day when the Emperor allowed commoners to present petitions. She didn't have a formal scroll or a polished speech. She had only the dust of her home on her clothes and the fire of loss in her veins. As she stood in the long line of merchants and minor nobles, she felt the crushing weight of the imperial atmosphere, a place where even the tapestries seemed to demand subservience. When it was finally her turn to step forward into the light of the throne room, the sheer scale of Cassian's presence felt like a physical blow, a reminder of just how small she was in the eyes of the law. Cassian looked down at the trembling girl, seeing not a person, but an interruption in his schedule. He noted the tear in her sleeve and the way she struggled to keep her head bowed, her body language radiating a chaotic energy that he found deeply distasteful. He did not ask her what was wrong. He merely waited for her to speak, his silence acting as a heavy pressure designed to make the weak wither away. He expected a plea for gold or a standard complaint about a neighbor, the trivialities of the poor that he delegated to subordinates. But as he opened his mouth to dismiss her before she could even begin, he saw the way her lips trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back a scream that had no place in his silent empire. The Emperor's voice cut through the air, cold and precise like a blade of ice. He did not ask for her story. He simply reminded her that in this room only the law had a voice. He told her that her presence was an irregularity, a momentary lapse in the order he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Cassian looked at her as if she were a broken piece of furniture, something that needed to be repaired or discarded, but certainly not heard. He commanded her to remain silent, to accept the compensation offered by the local courts, and to leave his sight without further disturbance. For Cassian, this was not an act of cruelty, but a necessary function of state, a way to maintain the vacuum of emotion that he called peace. Althea felt the words hit her like stones, each one bruising a heart that was already shattered. She tried to speak, to explain that her mother's looms were not just wood and thread, but the memory of generations. Yet the words died in her throat under his frozen gaze. The guards moved toward her, their armor clanking in the heavy stillness, preparing to escort her out as if she were nothing more than a stray dog. She realized in that moment that to the man on the throne, her entire life was a rounding error in a ledger. The injustice of it burned, a white-hot coal in her chest that made the air feel thin. She was being erased in real time, told that her pain was an inconvenience to the silence of the crown. Instead of fighting the guards or shouting insults, Althea simply stood her ground, her body rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor. She looked directly at Cassian, breaking the ancient protocol that forbade a commoner from meeting the Emperor's eyes. In that look, there was no defiance of power, only the raw, naked exposure of a soul that had been pushed too far. She didn't say a word, honoring his command for silence in the most devastating way possible. She became a mirror, reflecting back to him the coldness of his own hall, but with a human warmth that made the surrounding gold look cheap and hollow. The Emperor felt a flicker of something, a phantom pain he couldn't name. The first tear began as a glimmer in the corner of her eye, a tiny rebellion against the Emperor's decree. It didn't fall immediately. It hung there, catching the light of 1,000 candles, drawing the attention of every noble and guard in the room. Cassian found himself unable to look away, fascinated and repulsed by this display of unvarnished vulnerability. He had commanded her to be silent, and she was complying, yet that single drop of water was louder than any shout. It was an accusation written in salt. He watched as it finally broke free, tracing a slow, agonizing path down her cheek, followed quickly by another. The silence of the room shifted from one of respect to one of profound, uncomfortable weight. Cassian felt a strange, tightening sensation in his own chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child watching his own father harden his heart. He wanted to call for the guards to hurry, to drag her away so he wouldn't have to witness this, but his tongue felt heavy. The girl's tears weren't an act of theater. They were a leak in the dam of his empire. Every drop that hit the floor seemed to echo in his mind, mocking his belief that silence meant control. He had demanded her silence, and she had given it to him, but in doing so, she had forced him to hear the one thing he feared most, the sound of a heart breaking in the void he had created. The court stood frozen, a collection of statues in silk and steel, as the Emperor's gaze remained locked on the girl. Cassian felt a prickle of irritation that masked a deeper, more unsettling confusion. He was the master of all he surveyed, yet he could not find the internal command to dismiss this girl with the same ease he had dismissed entire provinces. The tears continued to fall in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. And for the first time in his reign, the Emperor felt the heavy crown on his head as a physical burden rather than a symbol of strength. He saw in Althea's eyes not a victim, but a witness to the sterile, lifeless world he had built in the name of safety. The air in the room grew thick with the unspoken, a tension so sharp it felt as though the very walls might crack under the strain. In Althea's mind, the world had narrowed down to the man on the throne. She saw the lines of exhaustion hidden in the corners of his eyes, the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. She realized then that his silence wasn't a sign of peace, but a prison he had built for himself, just as much as for his people. Her grief was no longer just about the lost looms or the destroyed home. It was about the tragedy of a man who had everything and felt nothing. She didn't want his gold anymore, and she certainly didn't want his pity. She wanted him to feel the weight of what he had discarded, the simple, messy reality of being alive and hurting. Her silence became her weapon, a quiet storm that surrounded his fortress. Cassian finally broke the spell, his hand rising in a sharp, jagged motion to signal the guards to stop. The metallic clank of their boots ceased instantly, leaving a silence so profound it was deafening. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching long and dark across the marble toward Althea's feet. He meant to speak a final, crushing word of dismissal, but the sight of her trembling chin stopped him. He had spent his life believing that emotions were the weeds of a civilization, things to be pulled and burned so the structure could stand tall. Yet, looking at this girl, he saw a strength that was not architectural, but organic, a resilience that didn't need a throne to assert its existence. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to reach out and catch one of those tears. The nobles whispered in the shadows, their voices like the dry rustle of dead leaves. They were waiting for the Emperor to strike, to punish the girl for her silent insolence and restore the perfect order of the day. They lived in fear of Cassian's coldness, and they expected him to use it now to erase this inconvenient display of humanity. But Cassian was no longer listening to them. He was listening to the frantic beating of his own heart, a sound he had suppressed for decades. The girl's presence was a mirror he couldn't break, showing him a version of himself he had tried to kill. A man who once believed that a ruler should protect his people's hearts, not just their borders. The silence of the room was no longer his ally. It was a vacuum that was pulling the air from his lungs. Finally, with a voice that sounded like grinding stones, Cassian spoke, but the words were not the ones he had prepared. He did not order her out, nor did he offer a hollow apology. He commanded that she be taken not to the dungeons, nor back to the streets, but to the west wing of the palace, the guest quarters usually reserved for foreign royalty. It was an act of such irrationality that a collective gasp rippled through the hall. He told himself it was to study her, to understand the threat her grief posed to his order, but the lie tasted bitter. As she was led away, still silent, still weeping, Cassian remained on his throne, staring at the spot where she had stood. He realized with a sinking heart that by demanding her silence, he had invited her soul into the very center of his world. The transition from the grand throne room to the suffocating luxury of the West Wing felt like a fever dream to Althea. She was moved through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted ancient wars, each thread a silent witness to the Emperor's legacy of conquest. The room they gave her was filled with silk and scented oils, a world of softness that felt violently at odds with the jagged edges of her broken life. She sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than her entire village, yet she felt more exposed here than she ever had in the crowded marketplace. The silence of the palace followed her, but now it was different. It was no longer the silence of the ignored, but the heavy, expectant silence of a captive bird in a golden cage. From his private study, Cassian could not focus on the maps and ledgers that usually occupied his sharp mind. He paced the length of the room, his boots clicking against the dark wood, a restless predator unsettled by a prey he couldn't comprehend. He told himself that keeping her in the palace was a tactical decision, a way to contain the spark of unrest she represented. Yet, he knew he was lying to the man in the mirror. He was haunted by the way she hadn't looked at him with hatred, but with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He had expected fire, but he had found a deep, still well, and he found himself standing at the edge of it, wondering how far down the darkness went. Days passed in a blur of forced proximity and icy distance. Cassian began to make excuses to pass by the West Wing gardens where Althea was permitted to walk. He would watch her from a balcony, hidden behind the stone balustrade, observing the way she touched the petals of the flowers with a reverence he had never shown to anything. She moved with a quiet dignity that irritated him, because it wasn't born of rank or decree. She was a constant reminder that there were territories in the human spirit that his armies could never occupy. He found himself wanting to break her composure, to make her scream or beg, just so he could return to the world where he understood the rules of engagement. One evening, unable to endure the curiosity that gnawed at his discipline, Cassian entered the dining hall where she was being served. He dismissed the servants with a sharp flick of his wrist, leaving them alone in the vast candlelit space. Althea didn't stand, nor did she lower her head. She simply stopped eating and waited, her eyes resting on him with that same unsettling clarity. He stood at the opposite end of the long table, the distance between them symbolic of the centuries of class and power that separated their lives. He asked her why she didn't use her voice to plead for her family, why she chose to stand there and leak salt and water instead of asking for the gold he had plenty of. Althea finally spoke, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to fill the cracks in the room's silence. She told him that gold could build a house, but it could not buy back the breath of a life spent in labor, nor could it patch the holes in a soul that had been told it didn't exist. She spoke not with anger, but with a weary facts-of-life tone that made Cassian feel strangely young and inexperienced. She told him that she didn't want his mercy. She wanted him to know that every time he demanded silence, he was building a tomb, not a kingdom. As she spoke, the Emperor felt the first crack in his own internal armor, a cold draft blowing through a heart he thought had been sealed shut forever. Cassian did not retreat from her words, though they stung more than any battlefield wound. He took a step forward, the flickering candlelight casting his shadow over her, but for the first time, his presence was not meant to intimidate. He asked her, his voice devoid of its usual imperial edge, if she truly believed that a ruler could afford the luxury of listening to every cry in the wind. He spoke of the burden of the crown, of the hard choices that required a heart of stone to ensure the survival of the many. He was justifying himself to a girl with no name, a realization that made his pulse quicken with a mixture of shame and a strange, budding respect. Althea didn't look away, nor did she flinch at his proximity. She told him that a heart of stone doesn't protect a kingdom. It only makes the king heavier for the people to carry. She described how the silence he enforced didn't lead to peace, but to a hollow echo where hope used to be. As she spoke, she reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the fine silk of his sleeve, a gesture of connection that was forbidden by every law in the empire. She didn't touch him, but the heat of her hand was a physical weight against his arm. She told him that she wasn't crying for her house anymore, but for the man who had forgotten how to feel the sun on his face. The Emperor felt a surge of defensive pride, a reflex born of years of absolute command. He reminded her that he was the one who kept the borders secure, who kept the starving fed, and who maintained the order that allowed her to live. He spoke of the cold reality of power, trying to reassert the boundaries that she was so effortlessly dissolving with her quiet observations. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded like a script he had memorized but no longer believed in. He saw his own reflection in her wide, dark eyes, and for the first time in decades, he didn't see an emperor. He saw a lonely man standing in a very large, very empty room. The tension between them shifted from a battle of wills to a shared, heavy realization. Cassian found himself unable to maintain the distance he had spent his life cultivating. He stayed in the room long after the food had grown cold, listening as Althea spoke of the small things, the way the morning light hit the looms, the songs the weavers sang, the simple joys of a life lived without the burden of a throne. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't command her to stop. He simply sat in the shadow of his own power and let her voice wash over him, a gentle tide eroding the jagged cliffs of his ego. The silence of the palace was still there, But it was no longer a weapon. It was a sanctuary. As the moon rose high over the palace spires, Cassian stood to leave, but his movements were slower, less certain than when he had entered. He turned at the door and looked back at Althea, who remained seated in the soft glow of the dying candles. He didn't give her a command, and he didn't offer a promise. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer just an irregularity in his ledger. He walked back to his chambers through the dark halls, and for the first time, he didn't hear the echoes of his own footsteps. He heard the rhythm of her voice, and he felt the phantom warmth of a tear that hadn't even been his own. The days that followed were marked by a subtle but profound shift in the palace's equilibrium. Cassian found himself neglecting the war room, his eyes drifting toward the window that overlooked the courtyard where Althea sat. He began to notice the small things he had once deemed beneath his station, the way the servants lowered their eyes in genuine fear, and how the air in his presence seemed to freeze. He realized that his empire was not a living thing, but a collection of people holding their breath. Every time he saw Althea, he felt a frantic need to justify his life's work to her, as if her silent approval were the only currency that mattered in a vault full of useless gold. Althea, though still a captive of circumstance, began to move through the palace with a quiet, observant grace. She didn't seek out the emperor, but she didn't hide from him either. When they crossed paths in the library or the gardens, she would offer him a small, knowing nod that felt more intimate than a lover's touch. She saw the way his shoulders stayed slumped even when he wore his heavy ceremonial robes, and she recognized the exhaustion of a man who had spent too long playing a god. She remained a ghost in his machine, a soft variable that made the rigid math of his life impossible to solve. Her presence was a constant, gentle pressure against the walls of his isolation. One afternoon, a high-ranking general arrived with news of a minor border skirmish, demanding a show of overwhelming force to maintain the silence of the frontier. Normally, Cassian would have signed the order without a second thought, viewing the loss of life as a necessary trade for stability. But as he held the pen, he felt Althea's gaze from across the room, where she was rearranging a vase of wilting lilies. He saw her flinch at the general's callous tone, and the ink on the parchment felt like blood. For the first time, the greater good felt like a lie told by men who were afraid of the truth. He dismissed the general without an answer, a move that sent ripples of shock through the high command. The internal pressure within Cassian was reaching a breaking point. He was a man defined by his armor, yet he felt as though Althea were slowly unbuckling every plate piece by piece, simply by existing near him. He felt a strange resentment toward her for making him feel human again, for making the cold comfort of his throne feel like a bed of thorns. He wanted to go back to the time when he didn't care about the flicker of pain in a girl's eyes, yet he couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't there to witness his struggle. The silence he had once cherished now felt like a suffocating shroud, and he was beginning to realize that he was the one who needed to be rescued. Late that night, he found himself outside her door, his hand hovering over the wood but hesitant to knock. He was the emperor. He could enter any room in the world, yet he felt like a trespasser in the face of her vulnerability. When he finally entered, he found her sitting by the window, the moonlight silvering her hair. He didn't speak of politics or laws. He asked her, in a whisper that cracked the stillness, if she thought a man could truly change the shape of his soul after so many years of being iron. Althea didn't answer with a platitude. She simply moved aside, inviting him to sit in the darkness and share the silence that no longer required his command. Cassian sat beside her, the distance between them shrinking until the warmth of her presence was the only thing he could feel in the vast, cold room. He had never sat like this with anyone, without a table between them or a crown upon his head. He confessed in halting breaths that he had spent his life running from the echoes of his own father's cruelty, only to realize he had become the very silence he once feared. He spoke of the nights he spent awake, wondering if any of the people he ruled actually loved him, or if they only loved the safety his coldness provided. It was a confession that stripped him of his titles, leaving only the raw, frightened boy he had buried beneath the marble. Althea listened with a stillness that was almost divine, her hands resting in her lap like tired birds. She didn't offer him the easy comfort of forgiveness, for she knew that some wounds required time to knit back together. Instead, she told him that love was not something a man could command, but something he had to earn by being willing to bleed alongside his people. She spoke of the courage it took to be soft in a world that rewarded the hard, and how his greatest strength was not the army at his back, but the heart he was finally allowing to beat. For the first time, Cassian didn't feel like a ruler. He felt like a man being seen for who he truly was. As the hours drifted toward dawn, a strange peace settled over them, a quiet that wasn't forced by decree, but born of mutual understanding. The Emperor, who had never known a moment of true rest, found his head leaning back against the stone wall, his eyes closing as Althea's voice hummed a low, wordless melody. It was a song of the weavers, a song of the earth and the slow turning of the seasons. In that moment, the boundaries of the Empire faded away, and there were only two souls caught in the transition between the dark and the light. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a bridge they were both crossing, leaving behind the ghosts of who they were expected to be. But the peace was fragile, a glass ornament held in a trembling hand. Outside the room, the machinery of the state was already beginning to grind against this new, soft reality. The nobles were whispering of a weakened sovereign, and the generals were plotting to reclaim the iron that had defined the dynasty. Cassian knew that by choosing to listen to Althea, he was declaring war on the very system that kept him in power. He looked at her sleeping face in the gray morning light and felt a fierce, protective instinct that was different from the cold duty of a king. He was no longer just protecting a subject. He was protecting the only mirror that showed him his own humanity. When Althea woke, she found Cassian watching her with an expression that was almost terrifying in its intensity. He reached out, his hand finally closing the gap, and gently tucked a stray hair behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, as if he feared he might break her, but his eyes held a newfound resolve. He told her that the world would not understand what they had found in the silence, and that the coming days would bring a storm that might destroy everything he had built. Althea didn't look afraid. She simply placed her hand over his, her grip firm and steady. She told him that empires fall, but the truth of a heart remains, and she would not leave him to face the silence alone. The storm Cassian predicted arrived not with thunder, but with the cold rustle of parchment and the sharp clink of armored boots in the hallway. Rumors had spread like a contagion through the court, whispering that the great emperor had been bewitched by a commoner's grief. The Council of Elders, men who had grown fat on the stability of Cassian's rigid rule, demanded an audience, their faces etched with a mask of patriotic concern. They did not see a man finding his soul. They saw a pillar of the state cracking under the weight of sentiment. To them, Althea was a defect in the system, a virus of emotion that threatened to destabilize the hard-won peace of the Iron Era. Cassian stood before his advisors, the weight of his ceremonial armor feeling more like a cage than a defense. He listened to their veiled threats and their reminders of his father's necessary cruelties, feeling a mounting disgust that tasted like ash in his mouth. They spoke of the people as if they were livestock to be managed, and of Althea as a distraction to be discarded for the sake of the crown's prestige. Every word they uttered made him realize how hollow his life had been before the silence was broken. He saw the cruelty in their logic, the same logic he had used for 20 years, and he found that he could no longer speak their language of cold stone. In the gardens, Althea felt the shift in the palace's atmosphere, the way the servants now scurried away from her as if she carried a plague. She saw the guards at her door being replaced by men with harder eyes, men who answered only to the High General. She realized that her presence had become a battlefield, and that by staying, she was forcing Cassian to choose between his empire and his awakening heart. The fear she had felt on the day her home was destroyed returned, but this time it wasn't for herself. She feared for the man who was learning to feel, knowing that the world rarely forgives a king for showing a flicker of human vulnerability. The High General, a man named Valerius who had bled beside Cassian in a dozen wars, approached the emperor in private. He didn't speak of laws, but of survival, telling Cassian that the army's loyalty was tied to his strength, not his mercy. He suggested, with a chilling politeness, that Althea be returned to the people before the unrest grew into a full-scale mutiny. Cassian looked at his oldest ally and realized that Valerius didn't see a human being in Althea. He saw a tactical liability. The emperor's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, a reflex of the old Cassian, but he stopped, realizing that force was exactly what they expected of him. That night, the palace was a hive of shadows and hushed conspiracies. Cassian returned to the West Wing, but this time his steps were heavy with the knowledge of what was being planned. He found Althea standing by the window, watching the fires of the city below, her silhouette a fragile line against the vast darkness of his kingdom. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but the words felt like a lie. He realized that to save her, he might have to lose the very throne that gave him the power to protect her. The conflict was no longer between him and a girl. It was between the emperor he was and the man he was becoming. The silence between them that night was thick, not with the peace they had discovered, but with the suffocating weight of an impending storm. Cassian stood at the threshold, watching the moonlight trace the curve of Althea's shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true meaning of fear. It wasn't the fear of an assassin's blade or a losing battle, but the terror of losing the only person who had ever truly seen him. He realized that his empire was a vast hollow shell, and Althea was the only living thing within it. The power he had spent decades consolidating felt like a millstone around his neck, dragging him away from the very light she provided. Althea turned to him, her eyes reflecting the flickering torches of the courtyard below. She didn't need to hear the reports from the spies or the threats of the council. She could feel the tension in the way the air vibrated against the stone walls. She told him, her voice a steady anchor in the dark, that she knew what they were saying about her. She spoke of the whispers in the kitchens, and the way the guards looked at her with hungry, predatory eyes. She told him that she was a daughter of the earth, used to the wind and the rain, and that she would not have him destroy his legacy for a girl who had no name in his history books. Cassian crossed the room in 3 violent strides, his hands gripping her arms with a desperation that bordered on pain. He told her that his legacy was nothing but a graveyard of silent voices, and that he would rather rule a kingdom of ash with her by his side than a world of gold in total isolation. His voice, usually so controlled, broke on the word alone, a jagged confession that left him exposed. He was the great emperor, yet he was begging a commoner not to leave him to the mercy of his own cold throne. The roles had reversed. The man of absolute power was now the one pleading for a reason to keep breathing. She looked up at him, her hand rising to cup his face, her thumb brushing over the scar on his jawline. She told him that a king belongs to his people, but a man belongs only to his heart, and he had to decide which one he was going to be before the sun rose. She warned him that the council wouldn't just take her life. They would take his soul by forcing him to be the one to sign the order of her exile. It was the ultimate test of his transformation. Would he return to the safety of the Iron Mask, or would he stand in the fire of his own vulnerability? The choice was a blade, and it was currently pressed against both their throats. As the first light of dawn touched the palace spires, the heavy thud of the great bell signaled a mandatory meeting of the High Court. Cassian felt the vibration in his bones, a summons to his own judgment. He pulled Althea into a final, crushing embrace, breathing in the scent of her hair, a scent of rain and resilience that he wanted to memorize for eternity. He didn't promise her a happy ending. He promised her that no matter what happened in that hall, the silence would never be his master again. He walked out of the room without looking back, his cape billowing behind him like the wings of a fallen angel, heading toward a confrontation that would rewrite the destiny of the empire. The throne room was no longer a sanctuary of order, but a den of hungry wolves dressed in silk and gold. As Cassian entered, the air was thick with the scent of old incense and the cold metallic tang of unsheathed ambition. The council of elders sat in a semicircle, their faces as hard as the stones of the foundation, eyes fixed on the man they had once feared above all others. They did not bow as deeply as they once did. The respect had been replaced by a clinical observation, as if they were waiting for a wounded beast to finally collapse. Cassian felt their judgment like a physical weight, 1,000 invisible threads trying to pull him back into the mold of the unfeeling tyrant they required him to be. The High General Valerius stepped forward, his voice echoing with a forced resonance that filled every corner of the vast hall. He spoke of the unrest in the lower districts, spinning a narrative where Althea was not a victim, but a catalyst for sedition. He used words like stability and tradition to mask the sheer cruelty of his demand, that the girl be removed from the palace and silenced permanently to restore the aura of imperial invincibility. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation, designed to make Cassian feel that his personal feelings were a betrayal of the millions he ruled. The council murmured in agreement, a low, rhythmic sound that reminded Cassian of a funeral dirge for his own conscience. Cassian stood on the dais, his hands resting on the hilt of his sword, his gaze sweeping over the men who had been his architects of war. He realized then that they didn't love the Empire. They loved the silence because it allowed them to commit their own small cruelties in the shadows. He looked at the empty space beside him where Althea would never be allowed to stand, and he felt a surge of cold, clarifying rage. For years he had believed that these men were the pillars of his strength, but he saw them now as the bars of his cage. He remained silent, letting their accusations and their advice pile up around him like dry wood waiting for a single spark to ignite. In the back of the hall, the shadows seemed to stir, and for a moment, Cassian imagined he could hear the sound of Althea's tears hitting the floor. He remembered her telling him that a heart of stone was just a burden for the people to carry, and he looked at the stony faces of his advisors with a newfound pity. They were terrified of a girl who had no army and no title, because she represented a truth they had spent their lives trying to bury. They were trying to force him to choose between his power and his humanity, not realizing that he had already made his choice in the quiet darkness of the West Wing. The silence of the room was no longer his command. It was theirs. Finally, the High General produced a scroll, a formal decree of banishment and execution, already drafted and waiting for the Emperor's seal. The room fell into a deathly hush as Valerius offered the pen, his eyes narrowed in a silent challenge. It was the moment of the great Emperor's ultimate test. If he signed, he regained his status as the Iron King, but he would lose the man Althea had saved. If he refused, he was declaring war on his own government. Cassian looked at the ink, dark and cold, and then he looked up at the gathered nobility, his eyes burning with a light that made the bravest among them flinch and look away. Cassian took the pen, but he did not lower it to the parchment. Instead, he held it between his fingers like a fragile life, his gaze never leaving the face of the High General. He asked the room, his voice a low whisper that somehow carried further than a shout, if they truly believed that an empire built on the crushed spirits of the innocent could ever be called great. He spoke of the silence they all craved, calling it the peace of a graveyard, a stillness born of fear rather than loyalty. The nobles shifted, the rustle of their robes sounding like a collective intake of breath as the Emperor's words began to dismantle the very foundation of their authority. With a sudden, violent motion, Cassian snapped the pen in two, the dark ink staining his fingertips like a mark of blood. He tossed the broken pieces at the feet of the council, the sound of the wood hitting the marble echoing like a gavel. He declared that the girl would not be banished, nor would she be silenced, for her voice was the only one in the entire palace that had spoken the truth in 20 years. He was not just defending Althea, he was declaring a revolution against the coldness he had once personified. The shock in the room was a physical thing, a vacuum of sound where the heartbeat of the Empire seemed to stop. The High General's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his weapon. He accused Cassian of madness, claiming that the Emperor was trading a crown for a commoner's whim. Valerius looked to the other generals in the room, seeking a signal to initiate the coup they had been whispering about in the dark. The air became electric with the threat of immediate violence, the guards at the door shifting their weight as they decided whether their loyalty lay with the man or the office. Cassian stood alone on the dais, an island of calm in a sea of rising rebellion, his posture radiating a terrifying new kind of power. In that moment of maximum tension, a door at the side of the hall creaked open, and Althea entered. She was not escorted by guards, nor was she dressed in the fine silks of the guest quarters. She wore the simple, dusty clothes she had arrived in. She walked through the center of the hall, the nobles parting before her as if she were a ghost. She didn't look at the council or the general. She looked only at Cassian. Her presence was a silent challenge to the violence in the room, a reminder of the fragility they were all so desperate to suppress. She stood at the base of the throne, a small figure of flesh and bone against the cold stone of history. Cassian stepped down from the throne, descending the marble stairs until he was standing on the same level as Althea. He didn't wait for the council's permission or the general's approval. He reached out and took her hand. his fingers interlacing with hers in a public display of solidarity that shattered centuries of imperial protocol. He told the gathered court that if they wanted an emperor of iron, they would have to find one among the statues, for he was done playing the role of a god. He turned his back on the throne, the symbol of his absolute power, and faced the men who sought to control him, his eyes clear and his heart finally dangerously open. The High General did not wait for another word. With a roar that echoed like a collapsing mountain, he drew his sword, the steel singing a lethal note against the silence. It was the signal for the palace guard to descend, a tide of black and silver armor rushing inward to reclaim the order Cassian had dared to break. For a heartbeat, the room was a blur of violence and shadows, the air filled with the scent of ozone and impending death. Cassian pulled Althea behind him, his own blade flashing into the light with a speed born of 1,000 battles. He was no longer fighting for a border or a title. He was fighting for the right to remain human in a world that demanded he be a monster. The clash of steel against steel rang out, a jagged rhythm that shattered the artificial peace of the court. Cassian fought with a ferocity the generals had never seen, his movements precise yet fueled by a desperate protective fire. He was an emperor turned rebel, cutting through the ranks of his own soldiers to protect the woman whose tears had become his only truth. Althea clung to the back of his tunic, her eyes wide as she witnessed the world he had built tearing itself apart for her. Every strike of his sword was a rejection of his past, a violent shedding of the iron skin he had worn for decades, leaving him raw and vulnerable amidst the chaos. But the numbers were against him. The council had planned this betrayal with the clinical efficiency of a butcher. As Cassian pushed back the first wave of guards, he felt a sharp, burning heat in his side. A spear had found a gap in his ceremonial plating. He stumbled, his breath catching in a throat tight with the metallic taste of blood. The room slowed, the faces of the nobles warping into masks of satisfied cruelty as they saw their god begin to bleed. They thought that by wounding his body they could break his will, but they failed to see the look in his eyes. He didn't look at his wound. He looked at Althea, and in that gaze, there was an unbreakable promise. Althea saw the crimson stain spreading across his golden sash, and a sound finally tore from her throat. Not a sob, but a cry of defiance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. She stepped out from behind his shadow, her small frame shielding the fallen king. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a shield. She had only her presence, her hands outstretched as if to hold back the tide of steel with her bare skin. The guards hesitated, their training faltering in the face of such irrational, naked courage. They were used to fighting men who feared death, but they didn't know how to strike a woman who had already died 1,000 deaths in the silence of their neglect. The High General stepped forward to deliver the final blow, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. He told Cassian that he had traded an empire for a ghost, and that history would forget the king who fell for a girl's saltwater tears. But as he raised his sword, the common people, the servants, the scribes, the invisible laborers who had been watching from the shadows of the pillars, began to move. It started as a low hum, a collective vibration of feet against marble that grew into a roar. They had seen the emperor bleed for one of their own, and for the first time in the history of the realm, the silence was truly, irrevocably broken. The roar of the unseen masses was a sound the palace had never been designed to contain. It was the sound of 1,000 suppressed stories finally finding air, a cacophony that paralyzed the elite guards more effectively than any weapon. The servants and the palace laborers, the very people Cassian had once treated as part of the architecture, surged forward in a wave of ragged cloth and raw emotion. They didn't have swords, but they had the weight of their existence, and they formed a living wall between the emperor and the men who sought to execute him. For the first time, Valerius and the council looked not at a leader they could depose, but at a reality they could no longer control. Cassian leaned heavily against the base of his own throne, the cold marble a stark contrast to the burning heat in his side. He watched through a haze of pain as Althea stood at the center of the storm, her hand still reaching back to find his, even as she faced down the high command. He realized then that his power had never been in the crown or the armies, but in the people's willingness to remain quiet. Now that she had taught them how to scream, the old world was dissolving into smoke. He felt a strange, lightheaded sense of relief, a liberation that only comes when everything you thought mattered is stripped away, leaving only the truth of the heart. The High General Valerius found himself surrounded, his sword trembling in a hand that had never known fear until this moment. He looked at the faces of the people, the baker, the stable hand, the weaver, and he saw a mirror of Althea's own quiet strength. They weren't fighting for a new king, they were fighting for the right to be seen. The guards, many of whom had families in the very districts Althea came from, began to lower their spears, their eyes shifting from their commanders to the girl who refused to flinch. The machinery of the coup stalled, the gears jammed by the simple, undeniable presence of a shared human suffering that had finally found its voice. Althea knelt beside Cassian, her hands pressing against his wound, her tears falling once more, but this time they were not tears of hopelessness. They were tears of a fierce, protective love that transcended the blood and the stone. She whispered to him to stay, her voice the only thing keeping him anchored to the world, as the edges of his vision began to fray into gray. He looked up at her, seeing the smudge of dirt on her cheek and the fire in her eyes, and he smiled. It was a genuine, broken smile that made the gold of the throne room look dull and worthless. He told her, in a breath that tasted of copper, that he finally heard it, the song of the world she had been trying to show him. As the sun reached its zenith, the High Court was no longer a place of judgment, but a site of profound transition. The council members had retreated into the shadows, realizing that their era of iron and silence had ended the moment the emperor chose a commoner's heart over a sovereign's pride. The rebellion didn't end in a massacre, but in a heavy transformative stillness. The people didn't leave, they stayed, watching as their wounded ruler was tended to by a girl with no title. The great emperor Cassian Virel was dying to his old self, and as Althea's tears washed the ink and blood from his hands, a new kind of kingdom was being born from the ruins. The recovery of the emperor was not a matter of medicine alone, but a slow, agonizing reconstruction of a man who had forgotten how to live. For weeks, the West Wing became the heart of the empire, though no decrees were issued from its doors. Cassian lay in the transition between worlds, his fevered mind haunted by the ghosts of the men he had been, while Althea remained a constant, grounding shadow at his side. She did not treat him as a fallen god or a broken master. She treated him as a man, tending to his wounds with the same quiet dignity she had used to survive the streets. The palace grew unnervingly still, but it was a silence of anticipation, not of fear. A kingdom holding its breath to see what would rise from the ashes of the Iron Throne. Outside the sick room, the world was changing with a speed that terrified the old guard. The people who had stormed the hall did not return to their roles as invisible gears in a machine. A spirit of recognition had been ignited, a realization that the emperor's vulnerability was the key to their own liberation. They brought small gifts to the palace gates, not gold or jewels, but the simple offerings of the poor: bread, wildflowers, and hand-woven cloths. These items were brought to Cassian's bedside by Althea, and as he regained his strength, he looked at them with a reverence he had never shown to the spoils of war. He was learning that true loyalty cannot be commanded. It must be harvested from the seeds of empathy. The High General and the Council had been neutralized not by execution, but by irrelevance. Their power had relied on a Cassian who was a mirror of their own coldness, and without that reflection, they were merely old men shouting at the wind. Valerius eventually fled into self-imposed exile, unable to inhabit a world where an emperor could be seen weeping. Cassian let them go without a word of punishment, a gesture of mercy that was more devastating to their pride than any dungeon could have been. He was no longer interested in the politics of silence or the strategies of suppression. His focus had narrowed to the girl who sat by his window, her presence the only law he now recognized as absolute. As Cassian took his first steps toward the balcony, supported by Althea's steady arm, he looked out over his capital with eyes that seemed to see for the first time. He saw the smoke of the chimneys not as industrial output, but as families warming themselves. He saw the crowded markets not as sites of potential unrest, but as the vibrant pulse of a living people. He realized that for 20 years he had been a blind man leading the blind, mistaking the absence of sound for the presence of harmony. He turned to Althea, his face still pale but his gaze burning with a new, gentle clarity, and thanked her, not for saving his life, but for forcing him to hear the scream of his own soul. The final rupture with the past came when Cassian ordered the great throne to be moved from the center of the hall. He did not destroy it, but he placed it in a museum of history, a relic of an era that had passed. In its place, he requested a simple wooden table, where he would sit and listen to the petitions of the people without the barrier of height or the weight of a crown. He knew the transition would be difficult, and that many would still prefer the cold safety of a tyrant, but he was no longer afraid of the chaos of human emotion. He had found a partner in the silence, a woman who had taught him that the loudest thing in the universe is the truth of a heart that refuses to be ignored. The morning of the new era did not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the soft rhythmic sound of the palace gates being opened wide. Cassian stood at the entrance of the great hall, no longer draped in the heavy, suffocating robes of the great emperor, but wearing a simple tunic that allowed him to breathe. Beside him stood Althea, her hand resting naturally in his, a gesture that no longer caused a scandal, but instead brought a sense of profound peace to those who watched. The air in the palace felt different. It was no longer a vacuum of held breaths, but a space filled with the murmurs of people who were finally allowed to exist. Cassian looked at the woman who had shattered his world of ice and felt a gratitude so deep it surpassed any title he had ever held. The transformation of the empire was not a sudden explosion of joy, but a slow, tender healing of 1,000 small wounds. Cassian spent his days not in the war room, but in the courtyards and the streets, Althea always by his side as his compass and his conscience. He learned to listen to the stories of the weavers, the struggles of the farmers, and the dreams of the children who no longer hid when his shadow passed. He realized that the strength of a kingdom is not measured by the silence of its subjects, but by the volume of their laughter and the security of their hope. He was a man who had traded absolute power for absolute presence, and in the eyes of his people, he had never looked more like a king. Althea watched the man she had once feared become the man the world needed. She saw the way his hands, once used only for the hilt of a sword, now reached out to lift up the fallen and comfort the grieving. She knew that her tears had been the catalyst for this change, but she also knew that the change had always been waiting within him, buried under the rubble of his own history. She was no longer the invisible girl from the ruins. She was the heart of the palace, the one who reminded the crown that every decree has a human face. Together, they were rewriting the destiny of a nation, proving that the most powerful thing a ruler can do is acknowledge the pain of the smallest voice. There were still nights when the echoes of the old silence tried to creep back into the corridors, ghosts of a time when emotion was a crime. On those nights, Cassian would find himself standing by the window, looking out at the vast, dark kingdom he had once tried to control with an iron fist. He would feel the old coldness trying to settle in his marrow, the fear that he wasn't strong enough to lead with a heart of flesh. But then he would feel a warmth at his back and Althea's arms wrapping around him, her head resting against his shoulder. Her presence was a shield against the darkness, a reminder that he was no longer alone in the void of his own making. They stood together on the balcony, watching the first light of a new dawn break over the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and rose. The silence was still there, but it was a shared silence, a quiet understanding between two souls who had survived the storm. Cassian turned to Althea and spoke her name, a word that held the weight of his entire redemption. He didn't promise her a world without pain, but he promised her a world where no one would ever have to cry alone again. As the sun rose higher, the great emperor and the weaver's daughter walked back into the light, leaving behind the empire of silence for a kingdom built on the truth of a tear. The legacy of the Iron Emperor became a story told to children, not as a warning of terror, but as a lesson in the power of the human spirit to reclaim its warmth. Cassian sat at the simple wooden table in the center of the hall, his crown resting in a glass case far from his brow, a relic of a man he no longer recognized. He looked at the long line of people waiting to speak, and he no longer saw them as numbers or threats, but as a tapestry of lives he was privileged to serve. The silence that once defined this room had been replaced by a low, vibrant hum of conversation, the sound of a kingdom that had finally learned how to breathe. Althea stood beside him, her presence the silent anchor that kept the entire court grounded in reality. She saw the way Cassian listened to an elderly woman describe her lost harvest, his eyes reflecting a genuine concern that no diplomat could ever faking. She realized that the greatest victory wasn't the survival of the empire, but the survival of the man's soul. He had learned that to govern was to care, and to care was to be vulnerable. Her own journey from the ruins of her home to the heart of the palace was complete, not because she wore fine silks, but because her pain had been given the dignity of being heard and transformed into a catalyst for justice. The shadows of the past had finally retreated, unable to survive in the light of the transparency they had built together. Cassian reached out under the table and found Althea's hand, his fingers squeezing hers in a silent vow that would last until his final breath. He knew that the world would always have its storms and its silences, but he no longer feared them, for he had found the one person who could hear the scream behind his own quiet mask. He had traded the cold immortality of a legend for the warm, messy, and beautiful reality of a life lived in love. The Empire was no longer a monument to his ego. It was a home for his heart. As the final rays of the afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, the hall began to empty, leaving the two of them in a space that felt vast and intimate all at once. Cassian stood and looked at Althea, the woman who had demanded nothing and changed everything. He spoke no grand words of state, for they had moved beyond the need for theater. He simply looked at her with a clarity that made the air feel pure, acknowledging that every breath he took was a gift she had returned to him. In the stillness of the approaching evening, they stood as equals, two survivors of a war that had been fought not with swords, but with the courage to feel. The story of the Emperor and the Weaver's daughter ended not with a coronation, but with a quiet walk into the palace gardens, where the flowers were allowed to grow wild, and the air was filled with the song of the weavers from the city below. They walked into the twilight, their shadows merging into one on the stone path, leaving behind the heavy doors and the golden cages of the past. The empire of silence was gone, replaced by a world where every tear was seen and every voice had a place. As they vanished into the green, the only sound left was the gentle rustle of the wind, a soft, living breath that whispered of a peace that was finally real. The story of the great emperor and the weaver's daughter reminds us that true power is not found in the strength of an army or the silence of a throne, but in the courage to let our hearts be heard. If this journey moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to support more emotional narratives like this one. Your engagement helps these stories reach those who need to hear them. Thank you for staying until the very end and for sharing in this transformation.